Um, Welcome to Christmas week. We're going to be doing Ezekiel over the next 2 to 3 weeks, probably 3 weeks, and then I'll have a break, and then we'll start Daniel in the new year. It's quite a lucky day. It's not raining, but it's a so-so day. It looks like it's going to rain. But anyway, some of you may notice that that's my friend Godzilla back there. I don't know how long I've got him for. But he's funky and cool, and he's huge. Some of you may notice that I repeat certain facts, and there is a method to this madness. The method is that not everybody's going to listen to all these back to back, and some people will just choose the books that they like, and I want to give as much of an overview as I can of the various books. So I repeat a lot of information, and it's great if you want to follow through and follow all the books that we're doing. But I've sort of done it backwards, in that I've got a section on YouTube where we're working through the Torah in 20-minute slots, but I've done the 12 minor prophets first, and then I'm doing the major prophets. So we're sort of working in the Old Testament backwards. I know I've covered lots of stuff with Sanctuary International. I've covered Kings and Judges and Ruth and various other books, but we'll maybe revisit them once we've gone through the Bible. But there we are. Anyway, on to Ezekiel. Now, do you know that the Bible is the only book you can read for a lifetime, and every time you read it, you can find something different in it that you've never read before? And I'm an amazing exponent of this art. Because every time I read through the Bible, or every time I read a book, there are new things to be discovered, and it's phenomenal. And I think the Bible grows with you as you grow with your faith, and the Bible allows you insights into things at the rate at which you grow. So get growing. It's an amazing journey. Ezekiel is probably the most neglected book of the Old Testament. We will probably spend more time on this book because it's so neglected, and also it's so difficult. The first half of Ezekiel is almost all doom and gloom and quite depressing reading. That's the first 24 chapters. It's long and quite repetitive, and most people don't get past the first 24 chapters. And once you get past the first 24 chapters, the expression that comes to mind is all hell breaks loose. It's craziness and visions left, right and centre. But the first 24 chapters is 24 years of preaching. Well, no, the whole thing is 24 years of preaching squeezed into one book. So people didn't have to read or listen to it all at once. It was spread over a 20-odd year period in 3 lots with long gaps in between. And much of it is not relevant to our situation, whereas there's lots of the books of the prophets, the minor prophets, that you could almost think that you were talking about today. Much of Ezekiel isn't relevant to our situation in the world. It's another world and another circumstance, and we're just not that familiar with it. There is language in Ezekiel which is crude and often offensive to modern ears, and that has come with the change in our use of language. There are some words that are used in America, like fanny. Well, fanny is quite a offensive and rude word in the UK. There are words which are used now which mean different things to what they used then. It's just like the symbol of the swastika. The swastika was originally a Hindu and Jewish symbol of peace, and now it's changed its connotation, and it's now a symbol of hatred. So you can see in this way the dynamics shifting, and there is so much about the Bible that we have to place into context, and we have to understand that people didn't necessarily mean what we think they mean, because we're seeing at the moment all the Black Lives Matter stuff, and we're looking at our history differently, and some people are pulling down statues and things. Well, 20 or 30 years ago, that history wouldn't have been looked at, and it's an ever-changing world, and we've got to move and change with the times, but we have got to realise that when these people were speaking, it was 2,500 years ago, and words didn't mean the same as they meant then. Somebody said to me the other day that why is the New Testament so anti-Semitic? And I said it's not. And he said it is. It's anti-Jewish. And I explained to him, well, Jesus was a Jew, Paul was a Jew, they were all Jews. And it wasn't anti-Semitic, it's just the way that it's written. And anti-Semitism wasn't a thing back then. It was when, for example, Jesus points out that those Jews, he was pointing at the priests and saying those Jews, not Jews in general, but it's a matter of we have to understand where things are coming from. And all that Ezekiel shows is a side of God's character that we don't really think about, and we don't really like to think about. And yet it's important to know God as he really is. But there's a severity in God's character here, which Paul talks about in the 11th chapter of Romans. Behold then the goodness and severity of God. Now, people love to hear about the goodness of God, and they don't like to hear about the severity of God. If you listen to radio and TV broadcasts, it's usually about the goodness and the love and the grace and the mercy of God. But you don't get many people talking about the severity of God. And so people get a one-sided view of God. Hiya, John. How's it going? And if you only look at Ezekiel, you would only get a one-sided view, but from the negative side of things. Now, the book of Ezekiel challenges us to ask two questions. Why do you read the Bible? Full stop. And secondly, how do you read it? And these two questions are related. The reason you read the Bible determines how you read it. Your method will come from your motivation. And there are many different ways of reading the Bible. There's the daily medicine way, which I tend to use in a sense. I listen to the Daily Audio Bible, which is a free app, and that picks out a little bit of the Old Testament, bit of the New Testament, bit from Psalms, and a bit from Proverbs, and then the guy who's reading it every day, Brian, interjects at the end, and he either just prays or he talks a little bit about what's going on and the circumstances around it, which I find useful. And I've been using this book for this way of learning for a number of years. And you go through the Bible in a year, and it's great because it gives you an overview, and you're constantly reading or listening. But quite often people just read a little bit. They'll just read a couple of verses or a chapter, and it's very rare that you only read your Bible it's very rare that if you only read your Bible in paragraphs, that you get the message of the Bible. And that's why I'm encouraging people to read the Bible in books. We would normally read a normal book, a paragraph. We wouldn't normally read a normal book, a paragraph at a time, and then put it down. If you read an Agatha Christie or a Tolkien, a paragraph at a time, it would take you forever, and you'd have lost the plot very quickly. So we gobble up books, but we don't gobble up the Bible, because the Bible is quite often it's a matter of we're not reading the right Bible, and I'll work that one out for you. All the Bibles are the same Bible, but they have different emphasis, like a study Bible as opposed to the New King James, as opposed to the Good News Bible, as opposed to the NIV, as opposed to the Youth Bible. Now, some people will find the Youth Bible really easy to read, and some people will find the King James really hard to read. And there's a King James and a New King James where the language is slightly different. And you've got to find the Bible that suits you, which is easiest to read and easiest for you to understand. And because there's no point ploughing through the old King James when all the these and thous make you confused. Because the Bible wasn't meant to be confusing. It was meant to be educational and a thoroughly rewarding book. But let's get back to Ezekiel. By the time you get to the end, if you read it paragraph at a time, you've lost the plot. So, and people don't really get the message of the Bible, just reading these daily doses. So I'm encouraging people to read it a book at a time, and that's in a sense why we start with the Minor Prophets, because they're reasonably short books, reasonably easy to understand, and they focus on one period of time. There are three approaches to a book like Ezekiel. The horoscope reading, where you take a line out of the Bible, you just flop it open, and that's your line of the day. There's the preacher's passages, and in Ezekiel they are them bones, them dry bones. There's chapter 34. Well, it talks about the good shepherds and the bad shepherds, usually preached at an induction of a new pastor. There's chapter 47, where the man goes into the river, ankle deep, waist deep, waist deep, chest deep, neck deep. And usually preachers use this to show how deeply you're into the Spirit, which is total misuse of the passage, but there we are. And chapter 18, this talks about a personal relationship and owning your own sin. You're responsible for, each man is responsible for his own sin, and he's accountable because each man is responsible, which is a really new concept for the Jews at the time, and we'll look at that in further detail further down the road. These are usually the four parts which the preachers major on, but people need to read the whole of Ezekiel, not for their own sake, not for the sake, but for the sake of getting to know God, because that ultimately is the reason for reading your Bible. So you are familiar with God, to know what kind of God He is. He really is, and how He responds to us, how He feels about us, and what He will do with us. It's to get to know God. And if you read the Bible in its entirety, you get to know God. And the more you read it, the more you get to know Him. And the more nuances you get to see. It's like living with somebody. When you first move in with somebody, it's all tender-footed and lovey-dovey and what have you. And then slowly as time goes by, you start to find the bits that you like and the bits that you find difficult to deal with, and you've got to get to understand the person to get around the bits that you find difficult to deal with. And reading the Bible is like that, and getting to know God is like that. The Bible is the Word of God, but He didn't write it. Humans wrote it for humans. It's an inspired Word of God. The Bible is written about real people in real situations and with real feelings. When you get that side of the Bible, the spiritual side comes across all the more. And that's the point of studying the text in context. The context is human. It's a human situation in which God said these things. So often we pick out the divine word out of its human context, and then we get into an almighty mess. When you pick out the context, the divine words out of context, you can basically make them say anything, and it's the wrong way of reading the Bible, and it's the wrong way of doing it. And the Jews didn't read the Bible this way. The this has only come in the last probably couple of 100 years. The human situation comes through time and time again in the Bible. Imagine waking up after a night of passion when you've married this woman and finding out the woman that you've married is the wrong sister. You got the ugly sister. It's hilarious and awful both at the same time. But then comes the divine word. As you sow, so shall you reap. The guy who did this cheated everybody, including his own father. And now he's been cheated. And he has to pay atonement for it. And suddenly there comes a serious word from the Lord in this story. But it's a human interest story. And then you let the divine word come into that human interest story. That's the way to read the Bible. And that's what makes the Bible come alive for people. That's why here we take a book and look at it, at who wrote it and who it was written for and how they felt about it and what was going on at the time. And all these things go into bringing the Bible alive. It's not just a bit of old ancient history with dust on. It's a real living story. And there's so much that it can talk to us about today. So we are now looking at a situation that's far removed from the 10 tribes being carried off into Assyria. We're 100 years later. Those 10 tribes ignored the prophets Amos and Hosea, and they had disappeared. But now we're looking at the 2 tribes in the south. You've got Little Benjamin and Big Judah, who were actually even worse than the 10 tribes, if that can be believed. These people had watched the 10 tribes of essentially their own people disappear because of their sin. And here they are doing exactly the same thing and more. There's something so stubborn and so obstinate about human nature that we do not ever learn our lesson. History repeats itself. It has to, because nobody listens. The one thing we learn from history is that people don't learn from history. And they should have known that they were going to disappear too if they ignored the prophets. But they ignore prophet after prophet. They ignored Isaiah. In fact, they actually got harder and harder when he preached. They would not listen to him. They ignored Micah, they ignored Jeremiah, they ignored Habakkuk, and finally the worst thing happened. It wasn't unadulterated sin. It wasn't all unadulterated sin. There were some bright spots. Josiah being one of the main ones. Josiah was the 8-year-old boy king. And he renovated the temple, and while this was happening, they found the 5 books of Moses put away in a dusty old cupboard. And they had gotten into a kind of worship that's all music, and the Bible got left in a cupboard. The books were found, and the king had them read to him, and he couldn't believe it. He said, "You realise we are heading for disaster." And he said, "We have to clean up the country, and quickly." And they had got so bad that they were sacrificing babies to a god called Molech in the valley of Hinnom. And it said that Josiah desecrated the valley of Hinnom, and it became known as Gehenna. And Jesus actually used this valley as a picture of hell constantly. in his discussions with people. But it didn't do the trick. Then comes Joahaz, the people's choice for a king, who was deposed by the Pharaoh after only 3 months, and taken to Egypt, and he died in chains. Then the Pharaoh put Jehoiakim in place as a puppet king. Then Nebuchadnezzar invaded, and here we have the east-west power blocks playing off against each other, with Judah in the middle. And they are going back and forth. Little Judah was getting trapped between the two world powers. God could have held these powers at bay, but because of the people's sin and the amount that they'd sinned, God wasn't going to do so and hold the people back. Nebuchadnezzar invaded and controlled the country for 3 years before he left. And then they suffered a series of attacks. The Babylonians came again, the Arameans, the Moabites, the Ammonites. And it was a real battery for the Jewish people. And the result was that there was very quickly only a city left of the people of God, and all that was left of the people of God was the city of Jerusalem, and they were now totally under the heel of others. Jehoiakim reigned for 3 months, and then came a very bad siege from Babylon, and the first deportation came at that time. The Babylonians came and besieged Jerusalem, and it was a terrible period of 2.5 years of famine and disease. When the city was finally taken, all the treasures were removed. Hezekiah had shown the people that had been sent from Babylon with a get well card, all the treasures of Jerusalem. And Isaiah said to him, "You rule the day that you showed these men the treasures." And he said that you will lose everything you showed them. And this happened. All of the top people were taken. It was a favourite trick to reduce a conquered enemy to helplessness. And you remove the top layer of society. And in the deportation, in this first deportation, they took 7,000 officers and soldiers of the army. They took all the craftsmen, about 1,000 craftsmen, and they took the artisans or the top echelons of society, and there were about 10,000 of them. And they basically left the poorest people. Now, Daniel was taken in this first trench of people, and we'll come to Daniel after Christmas. We now have the city of Jerusalem with only the poorest people left in it, and that was all that God had. Finally, we get to King Zedekiah, the very last puppet king, and he had a little army, and again there was a dreadful siege by Babylon, and this was the last of all. Zedekiah and his soldiers decided they would try to escape. All the gates were besieged, so they dug a hole through the wall, and they got out one by one and fled at night through the Kidron Valley to the Dead Sea. And they got as far as the plains of Jericho. Then Nebuchadnezzar's army realized what had happened. They chased after them, caught them up at Jericho, and they caught them, and in front of the king's eyes, all the king's sons were murdered, and then they put out his eyes. So that was the last thing that he saw, was he was watching the end of the royal line. And then Nebuchadnezzar ordered Jerusalem to be totally destroyed. Everything was to be burnt down to the ground, and Jerusalem was finished. And you remember in Jeremiah, we basically sat with Jeremiah whilst he watched Jerusalem burn. All through this time Ezekiel was living. He saw this happen, not always because he was there, but he saw it in visions. And it was the ultimate end to Jerusalem. And that really is the backcloth to his book. It's no wonder that he can be a rather depressing prophet to read. And in the first part of his book, this is definitely so. Afterwards, he gets more exciting and more positive. Once Jerusalem had fallen and was finished, his prophetic message completely changed. He went from warning of disaster to comfort and hope for the future, which is why most preachers like to preach out of the second part of the book. Let's have a look at Ezekiel's life against this kind of backcloth. And if you want to dig into the history of the backdrop to this, it's in second book of Kings, chapters 22 to 25. Ezekiel was born in 623 BC. He was a contemporary of Habakkuk and Daniel. Daniel was actually one of his greatest heroes. Throughout Ezekiel, he talks of Daniel as one of the three greatest and most righteous men of history, and the other two were Noah and Job. The name Ezekiel means God strengthens, and that was very much needed. He is called 83 times in this book a new title, which Jesus adopted for himself in later years, and the title was the Son of Man. No other prophet is called that by God, but hi Evie. No other prophet is called the Son of Man by God, but God called him Son of Man 83 times, and it is only used elsewhere in the Bible by Jesus about himself. It would seem that Ezekiel came to occupy a large place in the synagogue service, precisely because of the characteristics that awakened a guy called Wellhausen's scorn. Wellhausen was an early source critical scholar who maintained a rather anti-Jewish conviction that Judaism had been corrupted by the dead ritual of the priestly system, which he considered to be a late development. I'm reading a little section out of my Jewish learning now, which is Ezekiel from the Jewish perspective, which I quite often like to do. And Wellhausen led him to say that Ezekiel was really only a priest in prophetic clothing. All great literary prophets before Ezekiel had a negative attitude towards the temple and its ritual. And this fact gave rise to the popular sermonic phrase, priest versus prophet, which implies that we make a choice. We either follow the priest or we follow the prophet, believing either in ritual or righteousness. Ezekiel indicates that such an opposition between ritual and righteousness is unrealistic. As far as he was concerned, the true worship of God involved both the prophetic emphasis and the social justice, and the priestly ritual observed in the sacred temple. He emphasized both in this book, combining the drama of the ceremony and the dedication of ethics. This dual emphasis exerted a powerful influence on Jewish history. Judaism followed Ezekiel. It did not become a pure ethical system following the prophets alone, or a mechanical ritual system following the priests alone. Judaism became, as Ezekiel meant it to be, a pageant of ceremony ennobled by prophetic idealism. Because it was Ezekiel who pioneered the principle that ritual and righteousness need not compete for the soul of the true worshipper of God, and that priest and prophet can teach together, one may well say that he, more than any other, was responsible for the fact that at every Jewish public worship service, on every Sabbath and holiday, a reading from the prophets always followed the reading from the Torah. The liturgical practice helped ensure the words of the great litany. Prophets were taken into the heart of Judaism and preserved for succeeding generations. And maybe it's because of Ezekiel that we've got the books of the prophets. It may be it was prior to Ezekiel. It was always we go with the priests or we go with the prophets, and it may be that because of Ezekiel we've got these now. He was born during the reign of Josiah, the boy king, and he was a contemporary of Jeremiah. And whereas Jeremiah stayed to watch Jerusalem burn, Ezekiel was taken away, and that distinguishes them in terms of their place in society. Ezekiel was taken away as the top echelon of society, and Jeremiah was left there. And Jeremiah doesn't once mention Josiah's reform, because he may have seen it for what it was, that the king was trying to change the people, but the people were not changing, and it became rather a bit of a sham. And this is why Jeremiah was pessimistic, even though the reform, there was a reform by Parliament. And there's a lesson here for Christians. It's not just a matter of getting the right laws passed. Ultimately, it's about what the people want to do that will be done. You can make it illegal to trade on a Sunday, but if the people want to trade on a Sunday, they're going to trade on a Sunday. There's got to be a change from top to bottom, or rather a change from bottom to top, in the case of Nineveh, for example, where the people started to change, and that flowed through to the aristocracy, and finally the king followed suit. And thus the laws got changed, and they were the laws that the people wanted. He was taken away from his home country, never to see it again. And he was about 25 when he was taken away in 597 BC. And he was taken away in that first deportation, as was Daniel. And he was taken in that first deportation with the upper classes, which makes him one of the richer, more educated people of his time. He was born into a priestly family. And here we have a unique person who combines the functions of a prophet and the priest. And maybe that's why he's called the Son of Man, because he's the first of his kind. If we study the Old Testament, it's divided into 3 sections. Firstly, they were led by prophets from Moses to Samuel. Secondly, they were led by kings from Saul to Zedekiah. And thirdly, they were led by priests from Zerubbabel to Ananias and Caiaphas. And that's a real simplification of the history of Israel. And they were led by prophets, kings and priests, and none of them did the work that was needed. What they actually needed was all 3 rolled into one. And Ezekiel was the bridge, if you like, the missing link between the prophet, the king and the priest. And then you had Ezekiel, who was the prophet and the priest. And then we have Jesus, who's all 3 rolled into one. But Ezekiel is a bit of a foretaste of Jesus in uniquely combining the prophet and the priest, except he could never function as a priest. Ezekiel, that is, because you cannot function as a priest in the temple until you were 30 years of age. And he was deported at 25, and they didn't have a temple for him to function in Babylon. This is why Jesus began his ministry at 30, because it was the allotted time. The allotted time of a priest was 30 years old. And that's when the priests began, and that's when Jesus began. That's why Jesus had to wait as a carpenter, because it was all in God's timing. And God had specified that you need to be 30 to start in the priesthood. And so Jesus had to wait until it was God's timing and he was 30 years old. Well, he never became a priest, but he became a prophet instead. And he was from the very best priestly family. He was from the family of Zadok. And whenever anyone is crowned in Westminster Abbey, they play the music of Zadok the priest. And Ezekiel was actually the son of Buzi, or Buzzy. I'm not sure how to say that, but there we are, B-U-Z-I. And Ezekiel was of the family of Zadok, who were they were the family that was in charge of the sanctuary in Jerusalem. And they were all allowed freedom when they went to Babylon within their own settlements. They couldn't do any damage there, so they were allowed to build their own towns. And Ezekiel settled by a canal that joined the Tigris and Euphrates. There was a whole irrigation system between these 2 rivers in Mesopotamia. Meso meaning middle, and Potamus or Potamia meaning river. So it means in the middle of rivers, and it was in the middle of these 2 rivers. The canal or river is called Kibar, and they settled in a place which was named Tel Aviv, and the modern day city of Israel is named after that place where Ezekiel lived. Elijah? I don't know. My brain's all fuzzy. At some stage, Ezekiel married, and as a priest, he would have married a virgin or the widow of a priest. And he traded and did business there. But at the age of 30, when he should have started his priesthood, he was called by God to be a prophet. And it was an amazing vision of God that he had. And that started his ministry. Just like Isaiah saw the Lord, he saw the Lord too. But it was in a quite different way to Isaiah. It was quite a weird vision, and we'll talk about that some more. And for the next 3 years, that was the period of his main ministry. He was called in 592, and he prophesied from 592 to 589. And in that time, he did both miracles and preached. And this Son of Man, his main ministry was from the ages of 30 to 33. Sound familiar? And then there's a long gap when he did nothing, except for one day the Lord said to him, Ezekiel, I've got some bad news for you. Your wife's going to die in the morning, but you mustn't weep. Because at the very minute that she dies, Jerusalem will fall to the enemies. It will fall to Babylon. Now, record the date and check it and record the date in your diary, the very date that your wife dies. And it was some weeks later that a runner came from Jerusalem, came to Babylon and to report the fall of Jerusalem. And he said, when was it? And it was the very day that he lost his wife. And in this way, Ezekiel had to or got to understand how God felt on the day that Jerusalem fell. And it's a very real expression of pain and anguish and sorrow and grief that Ezekiel had to bear and withhold. 3 years after his wife died, he started to prophesy again. For all that time, he was silent. For 3 years, he was silent. God told him, your tongue would stick to the roof of your mouth. You won't be able to talk until I release your tongue. And when I release your mouth, you can talk, but you must prophesy. Isn't it amazing what the men of God have had to go through? It's incredible to me. So for years he couldn't talk, and then God opens his mouth, and in 1 year, from 586 to 585, he prophesied, and then his tongue got stuck to the roof of his mouth again. And the last prophecy came in 567, just for a few months. And all that is put in the book. And the last prophecy came when he was 50 years old. And he died quite shortly afterwards. He's buried in a tomb in Babylon, Babylon is now Iraq. And the tomb is at Kifi, K-I-F-I. And it's not far from Baghdad. Ezekiel was revered by subsequent generations. The traditional tomb of Ezekiel was a shrine for many centuries. Further evidence of his importance to succeeding generations is the frequency with which sections of his book are used in the prophetical readings in the synagogue, in spite of the fact that the Mishnah specifically forbids the public reading of 2 sections of Ezekiel. There are 10 prophetic readings from Ezekiel used there. That Ezekiel was chosen so frequently for prophetical reading seems somewhat strange, considering the doubts that the rabbis had about the book, because the laws in it, which seem to contradict the analogous laws of the Torah, and also because of their feeling that the mystical portions of the chariot had to be kept from public reading. And we'll talk a little bit more next time about the mystical side of Ezekiel, and the fact that that led into an offshoot from Judaism, which is called Kabbalah. He never saw Jerusalem again, and yet he painted a picture of a temple, the most beautiful and wonderful temple, which has never yet been built. That's the historical and personal history of Ezekiel. Next week, we'll look at the shape of the book and what the messages were that he communicated in those 3 brief times of prophecy. Well, it's been amazing sharing with you. Blessed and honoured to spend this time with you. And I hope you have a great day, and hope you'll come back and join us next Wednesday at 11 o'clock for the diving into the book of Ezekiel, and it'll probably take us the Wednesday after to finish. I've never taken 3 weeks to finish a book before, but I think you had to have the background and the emphasis on understanding where Ezekiel was coming from to truly get into the book. Well, God bless you and have a great day. Goodbye.